Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah shir. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and today we will be learning Amir Tzah Hashem Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. We begin with a brand new Siman, Siman Tezvav, Im Lahatir Tzitzis Mi Beged Lebeged, whether or not it is permitted to remove tzitzits from one beged and attach them to a different beged. V'din Nikra talis, as well as the halachas that concern a talis that has become torn. Uboy vav seifim, and here we have 6 seifim. Now, so far, what I've seen in this siman, this is a very, very, very complex siman. Sif Aleph is relatively simple, but Sif Beis becomes very, very difficult, so let's go. Says the Mechaber in Sif Aleph, Mutter lahatir tzitziyos mitalis zeh, it is permissible to remove the tzitzit strings from one talis, v'litnam b'talis acher, and then to reinsert them into a different talis. Aval, however, shaloi lahanikam b'beged acher, to remove the tzitzits from one talis and then not to reinsert them into another talis, so that you are really removing the tzitzits from the original talis with no purpose at all. Loi, that is aser. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Aleph, V'litnam, to take the tzitzits off of one talis and to insert them into another talis, that the Mechaber said is mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is okay, afilu mitalis chadash letalis chadash. This is okay, even if you're removing the tzitzit strings from one perfectly functional, relatively new talis, and then you're going to reinsert them into another new talis, so that there's no clear benefit in the second talis over the original talis. You seem to have 2 perfectly fine talisim over here, and for some reason you're removing the tzitzit strings from the first talis and you're putting them onto the second talis. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's okay. The kol shekain, certainly, mitalis yashan, if you're removing the tzitzit strings from an old talis, shamutar lahatir, you're allowed to remove them, v'litnam, and to place them, betalis chadash, into a new talis, sharoit salalav, that you want to wear, or l'kayim by a mitzvah, for the purposes of being mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzits. So, basically, and the truth is that really, what we should do over here is skip ahead a little bit. Take a look at Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Gimel. What's at work over here? What is the potential problem of removing tzitzits from one beged and putting them onto another beged? So if you take a look at Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Gimel, I'm just going to do the first line and a little bit of Eis Katan Gimel. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the Mechaber said, you're not allowed to remove the tzitzits from a talis and then not put them into another beged, right? That's what the Mechaber said. He said, Mutter lahatir tzitzis b'talis zeh v'litna b'talis acher. You're allowed to remove the tzitzits from one talis and then place them into another talis. Aval, however, shaloi lahanicham b'beged acher, to remove the tzitzis from a talis and then not to put them onto another talis, that you're not allowed to do. Why not? What is it that you're doing that's wrong? Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Gimel bebeged acher loy ki yesh iser, because there is a prohibition involved here, shemevazet talis shel mitzvah b'chinam. Because when you remove the tzitzits from a talis, you are denigrating that beged. That beged of Dalit Kanfais that had tzitzits in it was a beged shel mitzvah. It was a beged with which you are mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzits. Now, when you go ahead and you take the tzitzits off of that beged, you're denigrating that beged. Now, why are you doing it? Why are you doing it? So the Mishnah Berurah here in Eis Katan Gimel says, Ki yesh iser shemevazet talis shel mitzvah b'chinam. You are denigrating a talis shel mitzvah b'chinam, with no purpose. That you're not allowed to do. And that's why the Mechaber opens up Sif Aleph, and the Mechaber says, you want to take the tzitzits off of one beged, but you're doing it for a purpose. If you want to take it off of one beged so that you could put them onto another beged, so then you're not doing it bechinam, you're not doing it for no reason. Obviously, you're doing it for a reason. And the Mishnah Berurah said over here in Ois Katan Aleph, you're allowed to do this afilu mitalis chadash letalis chadash. Even if you're taking it off one new beged and you're putting it onto another new beged, if you're doing it, if you're going through the trouble of untying the tzitzits and removing them and retying them onto another beged, obviously you're doing it for some reason. You're not just doing it because you're bored silly. You're doing it for some reason. So as long as you're not removing it from the original beged bechinam, you're doing it for a purpose that you're allowed to do. Because then you're not being mevazeh the original beged shel mitzvah. You're taking off the tzitzis, but you're doing it for a reason. So now let's go back to Mishnah Berurah's Katan Aleph. The cholshkeit, certainly, mitalis yashan, if you want to remove the tzitzis from an old talis, you want to take the tzitzits off of an old talis and you want to put them onto a new talis, over there it's very clear why you're doing it. You're taking it off an old talis, you're putting them onto a new talis. So you're not doing it bechinam, you're not being mevazeh the original beged by removing the tzitzis bechinam. You're doing it to put them onto a new beged. Gam, so too, says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu mitalis gadol letalis katan. You're allowed to take the tzitzits off of a talis gadol that you wear by davening and put them onto a talis katan. Shetalis gadol v'talis katan shavim, because in reality the talis gadol is no greater than the talis katan. They're both a beged of dalet kanfos that you use to be mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzits. So you're allowed to do that as well. Aval, however, ein lahater tzitzits mitalis shel gadol, you're not allowed to take off the tzitzits from a talis that belongs to a gadol. That's what talis shel gadol means. You can't take the tzitzits off of a talis that belongs to an adult, v'litneim b'talis shel katan, to insert them onto a talis that's going to be used by a katan, by a minor. Why? Techiyuvai rak midrabanan. Because now what are you doing? You're taking the tzitzits off of a beged that was used by a gadol. The gadol is a bar chiyuva. So this beged was used by a gadol to be mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzits. Now you're taking the tzitzits off of that beged. For what purpose? To put them onto a beged that's going to be used by a child. A child is only chayim midrabanan. So why are you denigrating the original beged? Why are you taking the tzitzits off the original beged in order to benefit a beged for a katan? That's considered that you're doing it bechinam and that you're not allowed to do. Now, very interesting, says the Mishnah Berurah. Ubi Prima Gadim nistapek. We find that in the Prima Gadim had a question. Im mutter lahater tzitzits mitalos shel tzemer. Are you allowed to take the tzitzits off of a woolen beged, litnam betalos shel shar minim, to then take those tzitzit strings and put them onto a beged that's made out of some other fabric other than tzemer or pishtim? La paiskim, this question is according to the paiskim la'el b'simin tef sif aleph, the shar minim hu rak b'drabanan. Let's remember, when we first started learning Hilchos Tzitzis, we had a machlokes the Mechaber and the Ramah, and we learned the Shitas HaMechaber, who holds that it's only a tzitzits made out of wool or of linen that are chayiv in tzitzits midaraisa. So the Prima Gadim ponders as follows. We just saw one case. We said you're not allowed to take off the tzitzits from a talis that belongs to a gadol and put them onto a talis that's going to be used by a katan. Why? Because you took the talis off of a beged that was being used by a gadol, a real bar chiyuva, to be mekayim the mitzvah midaraisa, and now you're taking those tzitzis and you're putting them onto a beged that's going to be used by a katan. Katan is only chayiv b'drabanan. So you're denigrating the original beged. The original beged was used by a gadol, and you're taking off its tzitzits in order to benefit a katan who's chayiv b'drabanan. That you're not allowed to do. Ponders the Pri Megadim. How about according to the Mechaber? According to the Mechaber, you have tzitzit strings on a beged that's made out of tzemer, out of wool. A wool beged, according to the Mechaber, is chayiv tzitzis midaraisa. You want to take the tzitzits off of a woolen beged, and you want to put them onto a silk beged. A silk beged, according to the Mechaber, is only chayiv midarabanan. So again, l'chayra, you're denigrating the original beged, right? This is a beged that's chayiv midaraisa, according to the Mechaber, and you're taking off its tzitzits for what? To put it onto a beged that is a chayiv only midarabanan. So the Pri Megadim ponders whether is that the same. Maybe you're not allowed to do that. The same way you can't take it off the beged of a gadol for the beged of a cotton. So the Pri Megadim ponders this. The Artzos HaChaim, however, the Sefer Artzos HaChaim, Mekel Bazeh, he's lenient, and he says you're allowed to do it. Now, the Mishnah Berurah doesn't go into this, but this Artzos HaChaim, we do not find that the Artzos HaChaim disagrees with the original halacha of the Mishnah Berurah. The halacha that the Mishnah Berurah said that you can't take it off the talis shel gadol and put it onto the talis of a cotton, we don't find that the Artzos HaChaim disagrees with that. So why is it that the Artzos HaChaim is makel over here by a talis shel tzemer to a talis shel meshi, to let's say a silken talis? I was wondering, could be the reason is because when you're taking it from the talis that belongs to a gadol and you're putting it onto the talis that belongs to a cotton, not only is the cotton only a chiyuv d'Rabbanan, but the cotton is not a bar chiyuva in mitzvahs at all. So what you're doing is, you're taking the tzitzits off of the talis of a bar chiyuva, of somebody who really has a chiyuv in mitzvahs, you're putting it onto a beged for a cotton who doesn't have a chiyuv in mitzvahs at all. He's not chiyuv in mitzvahs. His kiyum ha-mitzvahs, his whole kiyum ha-mitzvahs is only a d'Rabbanan. He's not a bar chiyuva. In the second case, where you're taking the tzitzits off of a talis shel tzemer and you're putting it onto a talis, let's say shel meshi, it's true that there's only a kiyum mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, but the adult who's going to wear it is a real bar chiyuva. So maybe that's why the Artzos HaChaim is mekel in that case. Okay, ice cotton base. So the Mechaber said, you're allowed to take the tzitzits off of one talis, and you're allowed to put them in talis acher. Says the Hilchos Tzitzis, Ayin b'Pri Megadim, take a look at the Pri Megadim, Shakasav writes, De'im mitzuyim lo tzitzis acherim lahasig, if you can very easily go get other tzitzit strings, nachayin lahachmir, it would be proper to be machmir, shaloi lahatir tzitziyasav, not to remove the tzitzits from the beged. And it would seem that what the Pri Megadim is saying is, why should you go ahead and denigrate a beged shel mitzvah by removing its tzitzits, even if there's a purpose? But if you could easily get other tzitzit strings, so get other tzitzit strings. If not, for the cases that we're going to see right now in Sifkat and Gimel in the Mishnah Berurah, where there's a very, very valid reason to remove the tzitzits, because you're not denigrating the beged, the original beged at all. Let's take a look here at Sifkat and Gimel. So the Mechaber said, you're allowed to take the tzitzits off of one beged to put them onto another beged, because then you're not denigrating the original beged. You're taking off its tzitzits for a purpose. But if you're not going to put it into another beged, you're not allowed to. Explains the Chavetz Chaim, and we read this first line already. What's the root of the problem here? Ki yesh iser, because there is an iser, shemevazeh talis shel mitzvah b'chinam. You're not allowed to be mevazeh, a beged shel mitzvah. You're not allowed to denigrate a beged shel mitzvah. You have a beged that was used for the kiyam mitzvahs of mitzvahs tzitzis. By taking off its tzitzits, you're being mevazit. You're not allowed to do that b'chinam. Imloi, if not for shenizbala talis. Let's say the talis wore out. The original talis that had the tzitzits on it is already worn out. It's not roy for levisha anymore. Or you have a talis cotton that is just worn out totally. Maybe it's stained. Maybe it's odoriferous and you can't clean it anymore. So it's not roy for levisha anymore. Oz mutar lahatir tzitziyasav B'chol gavni. Here, there's no bezoyan. Why is there a bezoyan? You're not denigrating the beged shel mitzvah. The beged shel mitzvah has exceeded its usable lifetime. That's it. It's finished. It's worn out. It's done. Taking off the tzitzis now is not being mevaze it. It's just not usable anymore. So then that would be mutter. That's one case. Or another case, and this is interesting. Let's say you want to sell, we're going to discuss this later on. Let's say you want to sell this beged to a nachri. Now, you might react in surprise and you might say, wait a second, that you're allowed to do? You're not allowed to take the tzitzits off? That's denigrating, it's being mavaz the beged. But to take the beged and sell it to a nachri, that's not being mavaz the beged? It seems that in a chinavi, that's not being mavaz the beged. Why? Because when you take the beged and you sell it to a nachri, the beged is no longer going to be chayiv in the mitzvah of tzitzits. The bezoyan to the beged is you have a beged that's chayiv in tzitzits, and you used it to be mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzits. Now you go ahead and you take off the tzitzits and you leave it bereft of tzitzits while it still is a beged that's chayiv in tzitzits. That's the bezoyan. The bezoyan is it's a beged that was chayiv in tzitzits. It's a beged that still is chayiv in tzitzits. And you took the tzitzits off. That's a bezoyan. But if the beged wears out, then it's not a bezoyan to take off the tzitzits. The beged is done. If you're going to sell the beged to an Eina Yehudi, well, once it belongs to an Eina Yehudi, it's no longer a beged that's chayiv in tzitzits. Then the fact that it doesn't have tzitzits on it is not a bezoyan. It's not chayiv in tzitzits anymore. So far we have two cases where the Mishnah Berurah says it's perfectly okay to take off the tzitzits. Or a third case. Lasois talis beged shelo ya arba kanfos. Let's say you want to alter this beged and you want to make it a beged that's no longer going to be a four-cornered beged. So you have a talis cotton, right? Talis cotton is completely open on the two sides. In order for a beged to be chayiv in tzitzits, to be considered a beged of talis kanfos and be chayiv in tzitzits, it has to be opened at least roiv on the sides. Let's say you want to turn this talis cotton into a t-shirt. You want to sew the sides closed. Okay, once you sew the sides closed, it's not chayiv in tzitzits anymore. It's not a beged of talis kanfos. So to remove the tzitzits from the beged, to sew it closed and turn it into a t-shirt, again, it's not a bezoyan. So the bezoyan is not that you're taking a beged that was chayiv in tzitzits and you're being mavazit by turning it into a beged that's not chayiv in tzitzits. No, you want to change the beged, that's fine. You're allowed to change the beged. And it's not a bezoyan because it's no longer the same beged. It's no longer a beged that's chayiv in tzitzits. The bezoyan is when it was a beged that's chayiv in tzitzits, and it will continue to be a usable beged that's chayiv in tzitzits. Then it's a bezoyan to take the tzitzits off, and you're not allowed to. Aval continues the Mishnah Berurah here, nice cut and gimel. However, im roitza limkar talis liYisrael. Let's say you want to sell a beged of talis kanfos not to an Eina Yehudi, you want to sell it to another Yid. Aser likach tzitziyasav, you're not allowed to remove the tzitzits. Af sheYisrael hasheni yuchal lahatel tzitzis batzmai. Even though I'm selling the talis to another Yid, let him put on tzitzits. No, it's a beged that was chayiv in tzitzits. It's going to continue to be chayiv in tzitzits. When you sell it to this other Yid, you're not allowed to remove the tzitzits, because by removing the tzitzits, you're being mavaz of the beged. Afilu hachi aser, that would still be aser. Continues the Chavetz Chaim. Umoter lahaser atzitzits v'laseis tachteim yoiser noim. Let's say you want to remove the tzitzits from a talis because you got more beautiful tzitzit strings. You got nicer tzitzit strings. That you're allowed to do. Mishum hidur mitzvah. Oy kishem yishanim. Maybe you have a talis that has worn out tzitzit strings. Umisiram. So you want to remove them kedei lechadsham in order to put on new tzitzit strings. That also you're allowed to do. Oy, another case. Let's say kishenifsak chut echad let's say one of the tzitzis strings got torn off in a manner that the tzitzis are still kosher. Maybe one tzitzis string became torn, and all you have left from that string is kidei aniva. So the tzitzis are still kosher, but they're only kosher with the yevet. Afal pisha adayin tzitzis kosher, even though the tzitzis are still technically kosher. Afal pikein, still in all, mutter lahasir, you would be allowed to remove the tzitzis v'loseis tachteh shleima, and to put completely intact tzitzis that have the actual share of Yud Beis Gudlim onto the talis instead. Because what are you doing? You're improving it. That's a hinder mitzvah. You're doing it for a purpose. There's no bizayon here. V'da oid, and furthermore, you should know, says the Chavetz Chaim, de b'makayim shad tzitzis heim shleimim, in a case where the tzitzis are intact, u'ru'uyim lihinasem libeged acher. If you have a case where you have a talis or a talis cotton that has completely intact tzitzits, and the Mishnah Berurah says we're talking about completely intact tzitzits that technically can be removed and put onto another beged. Chavetz Chaim explains what he means. La fuke, I'm coming to exclude, says the Mishnah Berurah, imem rak kidei aniva. Let's remember halacha that we learned. We learned if the tzitzis strings tear, but you still have kidei aniva, so they're still kosher. They're kosher, but you wouldn't be allowed to take those tzitzits off and put them onto a new beged. Because to put them onto a new beged lechatchila, you need the complete share of Yud Beis Gudlim. And over here you don't, because they tore. So says the Chavetz Chaim, in a case where the tzitzit strings are completely intact, they're all Yud Beis Gudlim, so that technically speaking, you could remove these tzitzit strings from the beged that they're on, and you could put them onto a new beged. In that case, yesh min ha'achronim shekasvu, there are those achronim that write. He brings this down from the Oilas Tamid and the Eliyah Rabbah. The Yizayir lahater hakisharim v'hakrichai shalahem v'loy lahavsikan v'lekraya oisan. If you have a case where you are allowed to remove the tzitzits, so let's say you have a case where you have an old talis cotton that's worn out. So he said you're allowed to remove the tzitzits. Okay. Could you take a scissor and just cut the loop where the tzitzits go into the beged? Now, by doing that, you are completely passeling the tzitzit strings. Are you allowed to do that? So the Mishnah Berurah says there are those achronim that write that you should be machmir and you should take the time to untie them. You should not cut them and ruin them. Kedei shelo yechale oisan, so that you should not needlessly destroy them. Ukfar amru Chazal. After all, we know that the Chazal said, Gemara in Yevamos Yud Aleph Amud Beis, Lo yishpaich adam mei boiroi. A person should not empty out and spill out the water from his well. V'acherim tzrichim lehem. When there are other people who need it. Bal tashchis. Don't go ahead and waste your water, even though you might have a plentiful amount of water, but there might be a neighbor who needs water. So what are you wasting your water for? So too over here. You have perfectly usable tzitzit strings. Why are you taking a scissor and snipping them and ruining them? V'achai Adam Kasav, the Chai Adam writes, B'makam shekasha be'enav hatircha lahatir, if it is difficult, if the tircha or the time involved in untying the tzitzis is going to be too great a tircha, mutar l'natkam, you're allowed to cut them, ve'ein bazeh mishon bal tashchis, and this is not a problem of bal tashchis. Why not? Kevan she'ein oiseh derech hashchasa, because your purpose in cutting them is not to ruin them. You're not just going ahead and wastefully and needlessly destroying the tzitzit strings. You're doing it for a reason. You're doing it because you don't have the time. You're doing it because you don't have the energy. So you're not just doing it needlessly. And therefore, it's not a problem about tashchis, says the Chai Adam Ayin Sham. Okay, so far over here in Sif Aleph, what we have seen is that there is an inyan, there is an isser, not to be mevazeh a talis shel mitzvah. And therefore, you do not remove the tzitzit strings from a talis shel mitzvah needlessly. You only do it if there's a purpose. If you're going to put them onto another beged, so that's a purpose. If you're going to put on better tzitzis, that's a purpose. If the talis or the talis cotton is worn out and it's no longer usable. So then you're removing it for a purpose. So in those cases, it's okay. But to do it needlessly is asur. Says the Ramah. The Ramah gives a little bit of a caveat here. Says the Ramah, Hago. Vedafka betalis shel bar chiyuva. This entire isser only applies when you're dealing with a talis that belongs to somebody who has a chiyuv in mitzvahs. The same way we see that by the beged, if you have a beged of daled kanfas, and you want to alter it and make it a beged of gimel kanfas, then you're allowed to take off the tzitzit strings, and it's not considered a bezoyan, because it's no longer going to be chayiv in tzitzits. How about if you have a beged of daled kanfas that belongs to somebody who does not have a chiyuv of mitzvahs? In that case, taking off the strings is not denigrating the beged. The beged is not chayiv now, because it belongs to somebody who doesn't have a chiyuv. What's such a case? Says the Ramah, V'dafka b'talis shel bar chiyuva. This entire isser only applies to a talis that belongs to somebody who's obligated in the mitzvah of tzitzits. Aval mutter later tzitzis v'talis shel mesim. However, you are allowed to remove the tzitzit strings from the talis of a mace, because the mace is not chayiv in tzitzits. And indeed, this is the minig that they bury a mace in a talis, but they passel the tzitzits first. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Daled, bar chiyuva, afilu einer chayiv rak d'Rabbanan. This is true, even if the chiyuv is only a chiyuv d'Rabbanan, let's say a talis that belongs to a katan. Okay, now we move on to Sif Beis. Sif Beis, it's a very difficult Sif. So we need a little bit of a hakdama over here in Sif Beis. Back in Siman Yud, Sif Hey, it's on Yud Zayin Amud Beis. We learned in the Mechaber the psul of tzitzis of taseh v'loy min ha'asui. What's the psul of taseh v'loy min ha'asui? The Mechaber gave us a case. Hayula shalosh knafos. Let's say you had a three-cornered beged. A three-cornered beged is not chayiv in tzitzis. V'asa behem shalosh tzitziyos. You decided that you have this three-cornered beged. You decided that the corners look funny without tzitzits on them. So you want to put tzitzits on the three corners of this three-cornered beged. So you took perfectly kosher tzitzit strings, and you did a beautiful job of putting the tzitzits on those three corners. Maybe you even did it lishma. You said l'shem mitzvahs tzitzits, and you tied tzitzit strings onto the three corners of this three-cornered beged. Did you accomplish anything? No. The beged is not chayiv in tzitzits, and the tzitzit strings that you tied onto the beged, they're really not tzitzits. Not sure why you're calling them tzitzits. You're calling them tzitzits because you bought them from Eichlers as tzitzit strings. But they're not tzitzits. They're fringes. I don't know what they are. You tied them onto a beged that's not chayiv in tzitzits. So says the Mechaber, Hayuloi shalosh knafos. You had a three-cornered beged. V'asa behem shalosh tzitziyos. And you affixed three corners of tzitzis to this three-cornered beged. V'shuv asala knaf ravi. Then you altered the beged. And you cut the beged so that the beged now has a fourth corner. Guess what? Now the beged is chayiv in tzitzits. Oh, v'asa gam boi tzitzits. So now you affixed tzitzits to the fourth corner of the beged. You remembered, hey, wait a second. Remember I went to Eichler's and I bought tzitzit strings? The set of tzitzit strings came with enough strings for four corners. I only used three. Now the beged has a fourth corner. So you put tzitzits on the fourth corner. Said the Mechaber Psula, this beged is puzzle. Why? Mishum taseh v'loy min ha'asui. And the Mishnah Berurah over there, in Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Yodalid, explained, what's the psul of taseh v'loy min ha'asui? The psul is, the pasuk says, Gedilim taseh lecha. You have to make gedilim. Al arba kanfais kisusacha. You have to make gedilim. Taseh. Tzitzits needs an asiya bekashrus. You need to make them bekashrus when they are tzitzits. Now, when you tied the tzitzits onto the three corners of this three-cornered beged that you had, were they tzitzits? No. Were you making tzitzits? No. They look like tzitzits, but they're not tzitzits. So when you did that asiyah, it was not an asiyah of tzitzits. Later on, when you cut the beged and you created a chiyuv, with a beged that already has tzitzit strings on it that were not made bekashrus. They never had an asiyah of tzitzits. That's a chesaron of taseh. You should make tzitzits v'loy min ha'osui. Don't try to pater a beged with tzitzits that are pre-made, that were made before there was a chiyuv, that were made when they were not tzitzits. That's the psol of taseh v'loy min ha'osui. Okay, now, so what are the classic examples of taseh v'loy min ha'osui? One example is the example I just gave you. You had a beged that wasn't chayiv in tzitzits. You tied tzitzits onto it. It was a three-cornered beged. You tied tzitzits onto it. Then you created the chiyuv by making a fourth corner. Taseh v'loy min ha'osui. Another classic example. You have a beged of daled kanfos. It's chayiv in tzitzits. You take tzitzits and you attach tzitzits to it. Perfect. It's perfectly kosher. Now what happens? Somehow the beged becomes torn and one of the corners becomes torn off completely. Ooh, now it's a three-cornered beged. It's not chayiv in tzitzits anymore. Now it has 3 corners worth of tzitzits, but it's not chayiv in tzitzits anymore. Now you go in and you repair the beged. You repair the beged and you repair the fourth corner. It's chayiv in tzitzits again. Now you think you just are going to put tzitzits back on that repaired fourth corner. No, can't do that. Taseh v'loy min ha'osui. Even though when the other 3 corners of the tzitzits were put on the beged, they were put on bekashrus. So you might say, wait a second, you told me I need an asiyah bekashrus. I had an asiyah bekashrus. When I put those tzitzits on, the beged was a 4-cornered beged. So I had taseh. I had an asiyah bekashrus. True. But when the beged tore and it became a 3-cornered beged, those tzitzits, those remaining tzitzits, ceased to be tzitzits. They're not tzitzits anymore because they're on a 3-cornered beged. Now when you repair the beged, you're once again generating a chiyuv of tzitzits. But the tzitzits that are on are min ha'osui. They're pre-made. So that's another psol of taseh v'loy min ha'osui. Those are the 2 classic examples of taseh v'loy min ha'osui. Now we're going to see another type of taseh v'loy min ha'osui. And this is going to get involved in machlokes, the Magen Avraham, the Taz. Let's say you have a beged that is a 4-cornered beged, and it is big enough to be chayiv in tzitzits. You take 2 sets of tzitzit strings, and you affix tzitzit strings to 2 of the corners. You do it l'shem mitzvahs tzitzits, everything beautiful. You have a beged that's chayiv in tzitzits, and you put on tzitzits, and you did it l'shma, and you had an asiyah bekashrus, because it's a beged that's chayiv in tzitzits. So far, so good. Everything is good. Now you take it and you stick it in your drawer. All right. Now, 3 months later, and the time doesn't matter. I'm not saying 3 months later because that matters. I'm just giving you a story. Now, later on, you take out this beged that has 2 tzitzits on it. And you look at it and you say, you know, it's a funny thing. I have this 4-cornered beged that has 2 sets of tzitzit strings on it. And I remember that this is not the first time I did this. There was another time that I had a 4-cornered beged, and I put 2 sets of tzitzit strings on that beged. So I got 2 begadim over here, 2 4-cornered begadim, and each one has 2 sets of tzitzit strings. I can't use either one of them because right now they're both puzzle. They both only have 2 corners worth of tzitzits. And I don't have any additional tzitzit strings. So you know what I could do? Well, one thing I could do is I could take the tzitzit strings off of one and I could put them on the other, right? Sif Aleph, that would be perfectly okay. I'm taking the tzitzit strings off of one beged and I'm putting them on to the other beged. So now I'll have one beged that has 4 corners of tzitzit strings. Everything is fine. But that's going to take a long time. I have to untie them. I have to tie them back again. There's another thing that I could do. I could take this 4-cornered beged that has 2 tzitzit strings and this beged that has 2 sets of tzitzit strings, take them down to my sewing machine and sew them together. And now I got a beged with 4 corners worth of tzitzis. Hunky-dory. Now, you'll ask me, tasav aloy asui. Well, the first reaction would be, it's not tasav aloy asui. Why would it be tasav aloy asui? When I put the 2 sets of tzitzit strings on this beged, it was a 4-cornered beged, and it was big enough to have its own independent chiyuv of tzitzits, and I put tzitzit strings on it, bekashrus. And did this ever become puzzle? It never became puzzle. This 4-cornered garment, the same thing. It has a chiyuv of tzitzits. It's a beged of daled kanfas. It's big enough to have its own independent chiyuv of tzitzits. I put 2 sets of tzitzit strings on it, bekashrus. Tasa, what's the problem? Now I took it and I sewed the 2 of them together. Where is there a problem of tasav aloy asui? There does not seem to be a problem of tasav aloy asui. It's not like the second case that I gave you of the classical case of tasav aloy asui, where the original beged became puzzle. Over here, neither one of these 2 begadim ever became puzzle. So at first glance, there does not seem to be a tasav aloy asui problem. Yet we're going to learn that it's very possible that there is a tasav aloy asui problem. Why? So I'll give you a little bit of a heads up. The Mechaber is going to bring this down because the Torah Kedosha tells us va'asu lahem tzitzits, Klal Yisrael should make tzitzits al kanfei bigdeihem, on the corners of their begadim. The mashmois of that pasuk is that the tzitzits have to be made in order not to have a problem of tasav aloy asui. It's not enough that there was an asiyah bekashrus, that there was an asiyah that when you made the tzitzits, they were tzitzits because they were going on a beged that's chayiv tzitzits. It has to be al kanfei bigdeihem. It has to be that the tzitzits are being made to pater the beged that they are ultimately put on. Now, when you took one beged of daled kanfas and you put 2 sets of tzitzit strings on that beged, you did it to pater that beged. And when you put 2 sets of tzitzit strings on the other beged, you did it to pater that beged. When you take the 2 begadim and you bring them to your sewing machine and you zip them together and make one beged out of it, now you have 4 sets of tzitzit strings that were never intended for this beged, because this beged was just created, and this beged is created min ha'asui. This beged is being created and having a chiyuv of tzitzits, but it's being created with tzitzit strings already on them. These tzitzit strings were not put onto this beged. These tzitzit strings were put onto 2 separate begadim. Now you take them down to the sewing machine and you stitch them together, you're creating a new beged. And you're creating a new beged of dalet kanfais that's already affixed with tzitzits. That's a new case of tasav aloy asui. Let's take a look here at the Mechaber and Sif Beis. Says the Mechaber, Eina yachal likach hakanaf kemoishahu. You cannot take a corner of a beged of tzitzits as it is, imat tzitzios, together with tzitzits already on it, or letafrai bebeged acher, and then go stitch it onto another beged, mishum da'al kanfe bigdeim ba'inon, because you need to fulfill the requirements of the pasuk al kanfe bigdeim, uknaf zeh la yahaya mi beged zeh, and this corner was not part of this beged b'shas asiya, when the beged was made. So, you have a beged, and it could be a beged of dalet kanfos, chayiv and tzitzits. You have 3 sets of tzitzits on it, and those 3 sets of tzitzits will put on bekashrus, everything is fine. And now you have a problem. I don't have tzitzit strings to put on the 4th corner. So I'm out of luck. I can't use this beged. Okay. Then you have an old talis cotton that's not usable. Oh, what I could do is I could untie the tzitzits from that talis cotton, and I could tie them on to the new talis cotton on the 4th corner. That would be fine. No problem. But that takes time. Oh, I have a new idea. I'll take a scissor. I'll cut the corner off of the old talis cotton with the tzitzits attached to it. Now I'll take it down to the sewing machine and I'll stitch on the corner. Ta-da! Now I've got a 4th set of tzitzits on the beged. Says the Mechaber, you're not allowed to do that. Why can't you do that? Because it's true that now you have a beged of dalet kanfos with 4 corners of tzitzits on it. And at first glance, there's no problem of tasav v'loy min asui. The original 3 corners of tzitzits on the new talis cotton, what's the problem? I put them on bekashrus. I put them on when it was a beged of dalet kanfos. Everything is fine. The 4th corner, what's the problem with the 4th corner? When the tzitzits on that 4th corner were first attached to that corner was attached to the old talis cotton. So it was put on bekashrus. Everything was fine. Now I'm cutting it off the old beged. Now you might stop me and you might say, yeah, but Rabbi Weiss, maybe when you cut it off the old beged, maybe now you're passing that corner. No, not necessarily. Let's say you cut it off, and maybe it's even big enough to have a chiyuv of tzitzits. But we'll get to that. But now I took it and I sewed it on to the new one. What's the problem? Problem, says the Mechaber, is tasav v'loy min asui. But a new tasav v'loy min asui. Tasav v'loy min asui that's based on the pasuk of al kanfei vigdeim. It was never intended for this beged. And since it wasn't intended for this beged, you cannot use it on this beged. Now, the reason I paused over here for a minute is because I was pondering whether or not we should stop the share over here, but I don't want to stop yet. So let's take a look at Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Hay. Now, Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Hay, I have to tell you, is very complex, and I'm going to be fair. I'm going to let you know that I'm oversimplifying Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Hay. If you want to truly understand Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Hay, you have to look at the Magen Avram that he brings down. You also have to look at a Braisa, Menachos. But I'm going to give you, so to speak, the Daf Yomi version of Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Hay. I'm not saying anything wrong. I'm not going to say Chas Chalil anything that's not true. I'm just going to vastly simplify Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Hay. The Mishnah Berurah says, what did the Mechaber just say? The Mechaber said, you can't snip the corner off of one beged with its tzitzits and put it onto the new beged. And I told you can't do this because even if those tzitzit strings that you're snipping off with the corner, even though they were made bekashrus, there's a tasav v'loy min asui when you put it on the new beged because it was never intended for that beged. It wasn't intended for that beged. And now when you put it on that beged, you're putting it on that beged when it's pre-made. And that's Tasav Eloi Ben Asui, based on the pasuk of Asu al Kanfei Bigdayim. Says the Mishnah Berurah. I am the Magen Avram Sifkat and Gimel. Take a look at the Magen Avram Sifkat and Gimel. Umuchach midvarov. It is clear for the words of the Magen Avram that when is this halacha true? The dafka kanaf she'ein by shir lehis atef. Magen Avram says this is only true if the corner that you're snipping off together with the tzitzis from the old beged is small to the extent that it does not have its own independent chiyuv of tzitzis. How big does a beged have to be to have a chiyuv of tzitzis? It has to be kadesh yisatef by cotton. It has to be big enough that a cotton could wrap himself in it. So it's clear for the Magen Avram, says the Mishnah Berurah, the dafka kanav she'ein by shir lehis atef. When does this problem exist that you can't snip the corner off together with this tzitzis and affix it to a new beged? Only if that corner is small to the extent that it doesn't carry its own independent chiyuv of tzitzis. But if it would carry, let's skip the words in the Mishnah Berurah for the moment, the phrase that begins with va'af until the word aval. Aval, however, im haya ba'achaticha shir sheyeh by kedei lehisatef. But if you're cutting off a section of an old garment together with its tzitzits that is big enough to carry its own independent chiyuv tzitzits, it's large enough kedei lehisatef by katan, then mutal itzaref aisar lebeged acher afilu tzitziyasav. Then you could attach it to a new beged with his tzitzits. What's the logic of the Magen Avram? The logic of the Magen Avram is, again, the whole psul over here is based on Tasav Eloi Ben Asui. Says the Magen Avram, if you snip off from an old beged a piece that's large enough to carry its own independent chiyuv of tzitzits, so then how is there a Tasav Eloi Ben Asui? When those tzitzits were put on that beged, there was a chiyuv of tzitzits. After you snipped it off, there still is a chiyuv of tzitzits. When you put it on the new beged, there still is a chiyuv of tzitzits. So where is there a tasav Eloi Ben Asui problem? Therefore, says the Magen Avram, he's only nicha to what the Mechaber says if when you snip off the corner from the old beged, that corner no longer has a chiyuv of tzitzits. In that case, says the Magen Avram, then the tzitzits that are hanging on it are not really tzitzits anymore. Why are they tzitzits? They're hanging on a small square piece of fabric. That's not tzitzits. That's like putting tzitzits on a beged of gimel kanfais. It's not tzitzits. Now you attach it to the new garment. Now it gets a chiyuv of tzitzits. That's tasav Eloi Ben Asui. But if it was big enough that it always had a chiyuv of tzitzits, the Magen Avram says that's not a problem of Tasav Ben Asui. That's the sheet of the Magen Avram. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, Taz, Besifkat and Gimel, Poligalzeh, the Taz argues on this Magen Avram, the Oyser, and he prohibits this, V'chein mashbe b'levush, v'derech achayim, and the rationale is as I explained it to you, that this Tasav Eloi Ben Asui is a different type of Tasav Eloi Ben Asui. This is Tasav Eloi Ben Asui based on the pasuk of Asu al Kanfei Bigdayim. It's Tasav Eloi Ben Asui not because those tzitzis that you're cutting off from the old beged became puzzle. They never became puzzle. They were made b'kashrus. They always remained kosher. But it's Tasav Eloi Ben Asui because you're putting them onto a new beged that they were never intended for. That's the shita of the Taz. Okay? Even though we didn't really finish the page, I'm going to have to stop over here before we embark on Ois Kat and Vav, because Ois Kat and Vav, also Ois Kat and Vav, and especially Zion, become very complex. So, B'yirtzeh Hashem, we will continue with those next time. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discuss of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh should say Yeshua's for us, Parnas and Shidduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to the BS Tzedek B'Meheri V'Yameinu. Amen. Be well.